powerful new evidence tonight in the impeachment investigation. NBC News is reporting that Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman testified yesterday that U.S. military support to Ukraine was indeed contingent on Ukraine's willingness to dig up dirt on Trump's political opponents. That's the quid pro quo Trump has been denying, and that's according to two people familiar with Vindman's testimony. He's at least the second witness in the impeachment inquiry to draw a direct line between the holdup of military aid and Trump's demand for political assistance from a foreign power. This comes as the impeachment committees today heard from two Foreign Service officers with information about the shadow campaign that was waged to influence policy toward Ukraine. House investigators have also summoned former National Security Advisor John Bolton, among others, to testify next week. Bolton's lawyer said he would not appear voluntarily, but added, "I stand ready at all times to accept service of a subpoena on his behalf." Amid all of this, we're also getting new details about the Democrats' plan forward on impeachment, with a momentous vote scheduled for tomorrow. When it comes to Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, there's also new reporting today that he's shed new light on Trump's infamous July 25th call with Ukrainian President Zelensky. NBC News confirms that Vindman told Congress that certain details of the conversation were omitted from the White House summary of the call, omissions that he tried to put back in. Vindman identified at least 2 points that were left out of the official record. One, Trump mentioning possible recordings of Joe Biden discussing corruption in Ukraine. And two, Ukrainian President Zelensky, quote, mentioning Burisma by name. That's the company linked to Hunter Biden. The New York Times was first to report that Vindman said he tried to correct the record, but while some of his edits appeared to have been successful, he said those two corrections were not made in the final summary of that call. Well, that call record was already a damning piece of evidence for Trump. It showed that when Zelensky requested more missiles, Trump asked him in return to investigate his political opponents. But these revelations make it even worse. The omitted details are further evidence that Trump knew he was specifically targeting Biden, and Zelensky read him loud and clear. I'm joined right now by U.S. Congresswoman Dina Titus of Nevada, member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Peter Baker, chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. Glenn Kirshner is a former federal prosecutor. And Jeff Bennett is NBC News White House correspondent. Jeff, tell us about your reporting today that Vindman, in his sworn testimony yesterday in that deposition, said the military aid was contingent on the dirt on the Trump enemies.
And remember, Chris, in the opening statement that we obtained, Vindman, Lieutenant Colonel, told House investigators that he did not think it was proper for this administration to demand that a foreign government investigate a U.S. citizen. That word demand struck me as curiously conspicuous. He could have chosen any number of words. He could have said request, encourage, suggest, but he used the word demand. So we did some digging, and it turns out, over the course of his testimony, he went beyond that prepared statement. And what he told House investigators, were told by two sources familiar, was that the president drew a direct line between the White House deliverables, this notion that there would be a meeting between Presidents Trump and Zelensky, this delivery of this nearly $400 million in security and aid money, and to this demand that Ukrainian officials open investigations into a number of things. Burisma, the company on which Hunter Biden sat on the board of, the Bidens, the 2016 election, into CrowdStrike. And so basically what he's doing, he's telegraphing this quid pro quo that President Trump and his allies say did not exist. The same quid pro quo that Mick Mulvaney, the acting White House chief of staff, openly admitted to in the White House briefing room before trying to walk it back a day later, Chris.
Congresswoman, this gets to the heart of those who think that Trump is a cartoon of a president, that when he's alone, when nobody's listening, he really is as bad as people think, that he's sitting there thinking how he can get some dirt on a political opponent, how he can explore some crazy conspiracy theory of the farthest right fringe, CrowdStrike, that that's really who he is. Your thoughts and how that propels forward this impeachment?
Well, I can't tell you exactly what went on behind closed doors, but I can tell you that that testimony was certainly in keeping with the witness's statement that he made public, and he recorded it right in real time, reported it to his superiors, so you know he was upset about it and knew it was wrong. As for the president, yes, it doesn't surprise me. He's a transactional president. He likes to brag about being able to make a deal, and making a deal is really quid pro quo.
Peter, it seems to me, I'll say something I read before years ago, is when FDR became president, his idea of becoming president, of rising to the office, was to beat Franklin Roosevelt. This president thinks in becoming president, he becomes Donald Trump. At Donald Trump's worst. There's nothing presidential in these conversations what they're hearing about under oath in the last couple of days from Taylor and now from Vindman. We're hearing about a con man, a guy who goes in and said, in the words of Pelosi, I can shake down this foreign leader because the Russian tanks are moving. He needs Javelin missiles to stop them. I can get some dirt out of this guy because he's desperate for his own country's security. I can use that fear of losing his country to get dirt for my next election. This is lowbrow stuff.
Well, I think it's important to remember about President Trump that he's the first president we've had in our history who comes to public office without having served even a day in government or the military before arriving in the Oval Office. So everything to him is through the prism of his 70-year life up until now, which is in business and entertainment, where the lines are different than they are in diplomacy. They're different in government. And he's chosen not to observe the lines that his predecessors did. He got there on the strength of his style, his rambunctious, provocative, combative, bracingly blunt style. And as he sees it, why should he change himself? He has no need to adjust himself to the office. The office should adjust itself to him. Now, this is, of course, what's got him in trouble, because, in fact, there are norms and standards and lines that have been adopted over the years. Some of them legal. Some of them are simply political or diplomatic. And now we'll see what they will add up to in terms of this House impeachment inquiry. Does that add up to something larger than, shocking the standards of Washington, or does it actually add up to something constitutional?
Let me try one more time, because you write the main analysis piece on the front page of the Times. The voice of Trump that we heard in the bus on Access Hollywood, that voice, talking about how he dealt with people, with women. The voice that we heard through his attorney, through Michael Cohen, about how he paid off porn stars for sex and Playboy bunnies and the whole works. That guy, is that guy in the White House?
Well, look, he is a transactional person in that sense, yes, in the sense that he looks at, these conversations with foreign leaders in the same way he did, with talking with banks or talking with somebody he wants to, do a deal with. He doesn't see that in the context of Dean Acheson, Henry Kissinger
you're skirting it,
diplomacy, statesmanship.
I know why you're doing it, but you're skirting it. I just want to get back to that. Sounds like the same patois, if you will, to be fancy, but I'm going to go to Glenn on it. The voice I hear, as transmitted to us by Vindman, by Bill Taylor, the voice on that phone was Zelensky. Sounds like the same guy in the bus. Sounds like the same guy working through his fixer lawyer, Cohen, how to pay off women. That guy who thinks he can get away with anything because he always has, is now thinking he can get away with something in those transactions with foreign leaders, desperate to save. They're being patriotic. They're saving their country for the Russian tanks. What's he doing?
And Chris,
what's our guy doing?
You used the word shakedown.
Yeah, that's what was word.
That's what was going on here. And let me try to break it down in layman's terms for people, because we hear contingent foreign aid and quid pro quo, and people tend to get lost in that kind of verbiage. So now I think the Republicans are pivoting. Why? Because the process argument is falling by the wayside. The no quid pro quo argument is dead and stinking on the side of the road at this point. So what do we have? We have the Republicans saying, well, putting conditions on foreign aid is not out of bounds. That may be. Think about this.
Will they go that far?
They will go that far, because that's all they're going to have left. Think about this. If we say, you know what, we're going to give $400 million in foreign aid to a country, but we're going to tell that country, you need to stop government-sanctioned ethnic cleansing in your country. That would be a good thing, right? That would be a good contingency. But what do we have Trump doing? Trump says, I got your $391 million in aid, but you know what I want? this is hypothetically, he could be saying, I want a little piece of it. I want $1 million kickback.
Yeah.
We would all say that's dead wrong, an abuse of power, and an impeachable offense. He's doing something worse than that. Why? Because $1 million kickback is only worth so much. Dirt on Biden, a fabricated investigation that will help him win in 2020 is worth so much more.
You're right. A fundamental value to this guy. Anyway, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman's account appears to confirm what's long been suspected, that the White House summary of the Trump-Zelensky call was not entirely accurate or complete. That's because the inclusion of ellipses, those little 3 dots that says something's missing, suggests that at least 3 excerpts had been either removed or simply left out. The New York Times reports that Vindman's edits would have filled in one of those blanks, quote, where the 3rd set of ellipses appears. And while Vindman says he doesn't know why some of his edits were rejected, his account highlights the unusual way the call record was handled. The summary of the call was locked down on a secure server that served for this country's highest, highly classified state secrets. They squirreled it away in an old lockdown somewhere. Meanwhile, the White House today denied that Vindman tried to fill in any areas of the call record where ellipses were shown. Congressman Titus, tell us about this. I know you're bound to secrecy about the words spoken today, but the smell of it, what are you getting here in all these backdoor hearings in the skiff?
Well, just the fact that they would not include edits from the professional tells you that they've got something to hide. The fact that they put it in that secret lockdown place, again, tells you it was out of the ordinary. And although they said they were going to give us a direct transcript, they didn't. They gave us a summary. And don't forget, the summary said, I want you to do us a favor, though. I'd like to go back to your earlier point, though. This isn't just about not using good diplomatic language and being a good politician and not being a good businessman. This is constitutional issues. This is national security. This affects not just us in Ukraine, it's us in Russia. I think it's much greater than that. And what the president and the Republicans are doing is classic wag the dog. They can't defend the actions. They have no defense against the facts. And so they try to change the subject. They order pizza in the secure room. They talk about how some terrorist died like a dog, crying like a child. Anything to change the subject, complain about the procedure, because they have no defense.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.